The Bay of Pigs was the location of a failed military invasion of Cuba undertaken by CIA-sponsored paramilitary group Brigade 2506 on April 17, 1961. A counter-revolutionary military group made up of mostly Cuban exiles who had traveled to the United States after Castro's takeover, but also some U.S. military personnel trained and funded by the CIA. Brigade 2506 fronted the armed wing of the Democratic Revolutionary Front, DRF, and intended to overthrow the increasingly communist government of Fidel Castro. Over 1,400 paramilitaries, divided into 5 infantry battalions and 1 paratrooper battalion, assembled in Guatemala before setting out for Cuba by boat on April 13, 1961. 2 days later, on April 15th, 8 CIA-supplied B-26 bombers attacked Cuban airfields and then returned to the U.S. On the night of April 16th, the main invasion landed at a beach named Playa Girón in the Bay of Pigs. It initially overwhelmed the local revolutionary militia. The Cuban Army's counteroffensive was led by José Ramón Fernández, before Castro decided to take personal control of the operation. As the U.S. involvement became apparent to the world, and with the initiative turning against the invasion, Kennedy decided against providing further air cover. As a result, the operation only had half the forces the CIA had deemed necessary. The original plan, devised during Eisenhower's presidency, had required both air and naval support. On April 20th, the invaders surrendered after only 3 days, with the majority being publicly interrogated and put into Cuban prisons. Operation Northwoods was a proposed, and almost implemented, false flag operation against the Cuban government that originated within the U.S. Department of Defense, DoD, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, of the United States government in 1962. The proposals called for the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, or other U.S. government operatives to commit acts of terrorism against American civilians and military targets, blaming these on the Cuban government and using this to justify a war against Cuba. The plans detailed in the document included the possible assassination of Cuban émigrés, sinking boats of Cuban refugees on the high seas, hijacking planes, blowing up a U.S. ship, and orchestrating violent terrorism in U.S. cities. Operation Northwoods proposals recommended hijackings and bombings, followed by the introduction of phony evidence that would implicate the Cuban government. It stated, quote, "The desired resultant from the execution of this plan would be to place the United States in the apparent position of suffering defensible grievances from a rash and irresponsible government of Cuba, and to develop an international image of a Cuban threat to peace in the Western Hemisphere." End quote. Several other proposals were included within Operation Northwoods, including real or simulated actions against various U.S. military and civilian targets. The operation recommended developing a, quote, communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington, End quote. The plan was drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, signed by Chairman Lyman Lemnitzer, and sent to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, but was rejected by John F. Kennedy. Following presentation of the Northwoods plan, Kennedy removed Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, although he later appointed him Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in January 1963. U.S. military leaders began to perceive Kennedy as going soft on Cuba, and the president became increasingly unpopular with the military, a rift that came to a head during Kennedy's disagreements with the service chiefs over the Cuban Missile Crisis. John Fitzgerald Jack Kennedy, born May 29, 1917, commonly referred to by his initials as just JFK, the 35th President of the United States of America, was assassinated on November 22, 1963, at 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time in Dallas, Texas, while riding in a presidential motorcade through Dealey Plaza. Kennedy was riding with his wife Jacqueline, Texas Governor John Connally, and Connally's wife Nellie when he was fatally shot, according to the Warren Commission report, by former U.S. Marine Lee Harvey Oswald, firing in ambush from a nearby building. Governor Connally was seriously wounded in the attack. The motorcade rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where President Kennedy was pronounced dead about 30 minutes after the shooting. Connally recovered from his injuries. Oswald was arrested by the Dallas Police Department 70 minutes after the initial shooting. Oswald was charged under Texas state law with the murder of Kennedy, as well as that of Dallas policeman J.D. Tippit, who had been fatally shot a short time after the assassination. At 11:21 a.m., November 24, 1963, as live television cameras were covering his transfer from the city jail to the county jail, Oswald was fatally shot in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters by Dallas nightclub operator Jack Ruby. Oswald was taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he soon died. Ruby was convicted of Oswald's murder, though it was later overturned on appeal, and Ruby died in prison in 1967 while awaiting a new trial. After a 10-month investigation, the Warren Commission concluded in 1964 that Oswald assassinated Kennedy, that Oswald had acted entirely alone, and that Ruby had acted alone in killing Oswald. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson automatically assumed the presidency upon Kennedy's death. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, also known as the USS Maddox incident, was an international confrontation that led to the United States engaging more directly in the Vietnam War. It involved either one or two separate confrontations involving North Vietnam and the United States in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The original American report blamed North Vietnam for both incidents, but eventually became very controversial with widespread belief that at least one and possibly both incidents were false, and possibly deliberately so. On August 2, 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox, while performing a signals intelligence patrol as part of DeSoto operations, was pursued by 3 North Vietnamese Navy torpedo boats of the 135th Torpedo Squadron. Maddox fired 3 warning shots, and the North Vietnamese boats then attacked with torpedoes and machine gun fire. Maddox expended over 280 3-inch 76.2 millimeter and 5-inch 127 millimeter shells in a sea battle. 1 U.S. aircraft was damaged, 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats were damaged, and 4 North Vietnamese sailors were killed, with 6 more wounded. There were no U.S. casualties. Maddox was, quote, unscathed except for a single bullet hole from a Vietnamese machine gun round, end quote. It was originally claimed by the National Security Agency, NSA, that a second Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred on August 4, 1964, as another sea battle, but instead evidence was found of, quote, Tonkin ghosts, unquote, false radar images, and not actual North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The outcome of these 2 incidents was the passage by Congress of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to assist any Southeast Asian country whose government was considered to be jeopardized by, quote, communist aggression, end quote. The resolution served as Johnson's legal justification for deploying U.S. conventional forces and the commencement of open warfare against North Vietnam.